Good morning. The Monster's Ring. I'm going to read chapter 13 and what's called an epilogue. And in the book, an epilogue is like an extra chapter. After the story ends, like another further explanation. All right? Chapter 13, Home Run. Russell woke up with a start. The cold gray light of morning was leaking through the window. He looked down at his body. His body. He had it back. He was himself again. He let a whoop of joy. "Be quiet," yelled Mr. Alives from the back of the shop. "I'm trying to sleep." Russell held in his excitement, but it wasn't easy. He wanted to sing, shout, dance. He was Russell Craniker, 5th grade boy, and Russell the Monster was gone, gone, gone. Then he realized that he had a new problem. His clothes had been burned off during his transformation the night before. He was stark naked. Now, what was he going to do? He sat for a moment, pondering the question. Finally gathering his courage, he stepped from behind the counter and went to the curtain. He noticed the owl that sat on the cash register looking at him. "Mind your own business," he whispered, feeling himself blush. Ignoring the bird, he pulled aside the curtain and said softly, "Mr. Alives, I need to talk to you." Here he is. "Go away. But I need your help." "Go away. I've helped you enough." "But I don't have any clothes." "That's hardly my fault." "But how can I get home?" "Walk." "I can't do that." "Young man, if you do not leave my shop soon, I will show you a blast of magic that will make that silly ring I sold you seem like a toy it was. Now go." Russell stepped away from the curtains. He was naked. How could he go home? On the other hand, how could he stay here? He thought it over. Considering how much trouble he was in already, being naked when he got home wasn't going to make that much of a difference. But when he reached the door, he couldn't force himself to open it. The idea that he'd almost made sense 30 seconds ago now seemed insane. He tried to convince himself. It was Sunday morning. It was only 6 o'clock, and the light was still dim. Hardly anyone would be up at this hour. Besides the bare facts, the fact was there was nothing else he could do. He wanted to make a run for it. At last, his hand obeyed his orders. He reached out, opened the door, and slipped through. Immediately, he felt like everyone in the town was looking at him. Even the buildings seemed to have eyes. Yet the world was strangely silent. He shivered at the feel of the cool October air against his bare skin. Then he began to run. When he reached the corner, he noticed that the ring was gone. It must have slipped off his hand when he returned it to normal. He hesitated for a moment. Did he want it back or not? He turned back toward the shop. No. Gone was gone. The ring had caused him enough trouble already. To his shock, he realized the shop was gone too. He decided maybe that wasn't so surprising after all. Well, goodbye, ring. And goodbye, Mr. Alives. He waved a hand in farewell. Then he started to run. Once the first fright had passed, Russell actually began to enjoy his homeward run. The chill in the air and the sheer craziness of running across town in his birthday suit made him wildly alert. He felt open to the world, delighted by every sight and sound his greedy senses could absorb. By taking the backyards, he managed to remain unseen until he reached a development where he lived. Then, scooting behind a gray house, he saw a tired-looking woman standing at a window, holding a cup of coffee and gazing out with her eyelids at half-mast. That means they're like half closed. When she saw Russell, it looked as if someone had plugged in her curlers. Her eyes shot up, her jaw dropped down, the coffee flew in all directions. She strained to see who it was, but he was gone, trying not to let his laughter slow him down. 5 minutes later, he was home and facing a new problem. What was the best way to get into the house? When he was the beast, it had been easy, at least until he grew those wings. He could just scramble up the side of the house and through a window. No way to do that now. In fact, the only way was through the front door, using the key hidden under the mat. Taking a deep breath, Russell scooted around to the front of the house. As he bent over to get a key, he heard a scream from across the street. It was Mrs. Michelmeyer. She had stepped out to get her morning paper. Now she stood with her hands pressed to her cheeks, and her eyes were bulging out. Russell unlocked the door and slipped inside as fast as he could. Peeking through the window, he saw Mrs. Michelmeyer staring at the house. Her face was twitching, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be showing anger or just astonishment. Well, that put an end to the idea that he could keep his parents from knowing he had been running around without any clothes on. Mrs. Michelmeyer never kept her mouth shut. Actually, if she stayed true to form, the entire neighborhood would know he had been running around stark naked. Shaking his head, he tiptoed up the stairway and toward his room. He opened the door, then stepped back quickly. His mother was sitting in the chair beside his bed, sound asleep. Russell was sure she had been there all night, waiting for him to come home. He scurried down the hall to the bathroom, grabbed a towel, and wrapped it around his waist. Once back in his room, he switched it from his bathrobe, which hung on the bedpost. Then he went to his mother and gently shook her shoulder. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm home." Her eyes flew open. She jumped up and threw her arms around him, hugging him close, hugging her back. He could feel her tears on his head. "Where have you been?" she demanded, thrusting him away from her. Then she caught herself and pulled him close again. "Never mind," she said. "I'm just glad you're home." Russell knew that he would have to tell her something eventually, but for now the words "never mind," words he didn't think he had ever heard her speak before, were just about the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Now the epilogue. Russell was sitting in his room thinking. Actually, he was supposed to be doing his homework, but thoughts of the ring kept pushing into his mind. He wasn't sure why. He hadn't thought about it too much once everything had settled down after Halloween week. Of course, there had been a lot to settle down. First, he'd had to deal with his parents. He smiled as he remembered the story he had spun out to explain his absence that night. Actually, the yarn, or the tale, had had bits of truth in it. He had blamed the trouble of the teenage boys, telling his parents that the boys had taken him into the woods and burned his clothes as a Halloween prank. His father had been furious and wanted to call the police, but Russell had convinced him that there was no point, and that since the boys had been wearing masks, he had no idea who they were. Well, then there was Mr. Raffenschnitz and his well-shaking lecture to Russell on the Monday after Halloween, not to mention 2 weeks of staying after school to pay for his crimes. And of course, there was Eddie. His reaction to Russell in school after Halloween had been so comical that teachers and kids alike had besieged Russell with questions about what had happened. His non-committal answer had not satisfied them, but had left Eddie in some self-respect. Eddie seemed grateful for that, all because of the ring. Russell looked at the faint scar it had left on his finger and smiled. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain just under the scar. He looked again, more closely. The scar, usually almost invisible, was bright red, and it was throbbing as if it was on fire. What was going on? Russell looked up and saw the moonlight spilling over his windowsill, the light of the first full moon since Halloween. His skin began to itch. His forehead started to throb. A wild urge to howl rose within him. Now finally he understood what Mr. Elias had meant by after effects. He sighed. "Well, Craniker," he told himself, "that's what you get for not following directions." Crossing to the window, he laid one hairy paw on the sill. It was time to go out for the night. Ooh! Hope you enjoyed it.